What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so Marvel Comics Annihilation is a story that I've never really touched on it, but I've never really done anything with it before. The only time I've ever really talked about it in truth was when it was like, hey, and while Civil War was going on, Annihilation was happening, or maybe mentioning a few things here and there, but it was never something that I actually covered, and we're going to do that here. We're going to cover Annihilation. Now, Annihilation is a really good example of how people remember the bad more than the good, and what I mean by that is, back when Joe Quesada took over as, the editor-in-chief of Marvel in 2000, from that point for like the next 10 or 11 years, people always pointed to things like One More Day, like Brand New Day, and they were just like, oh, look how bad Joe Quesada was. No. Joe Quesada was not nearly as bad as people think he is, and the reason why is because when he came on in 2000, Marvel was still kind of recovering from the near collapse of the comic industry in the mid-90s, and so Quesada was like, we need to revamp everything. I mean, like, literally, we have to give people a reason to care. We need to move into a new generation, and so under Quesada's watch, it was really more like a soft reboot as opposed to like a hard reboot, like New 52 or something like that. But one of the first things he did is he basically sat down and he started grabbing people who historically had been great at revamping a lot of things. For example, Keith Giffen in, I guess, after Crisis on Infinite Earths, helped DC to launch Justice League International, the newest iteration of Justice League. And so it made sense that in the 2000s, Quesada would tap Keith Giffen to launch Annihilation. Now, the reason why Annihilation was done was because of the fact that up to this point, Marvel's cosmology was just this laboring beast gasping for breath. I mean, Marvel had almost never done anything with it. I mean, you had like Infinity Gauntlet and you had Infinity War and you had a couple Thanos stories here and there, and you had some Marvel stories that had long since been canceled. You had some Quasar stories which were scraping the bottom when it came to sales. I mean, when people were reading stories of Marvel, they were reading Avengers, Spider-Man, Captain America, Thor. You almost never saw anybody dealing with the Marvel cosmology. And so Keith Giffen, Dan Abnett, all these guys sat down and said, let's just reinvigorate the Marvel cosmology. I mean, let's reinvigorate interest in Thanos and Galactus and the Silver Surfer. And the way we're going to do this is basically have an event where a being from another dimension is going to invade the universe. Now, the cool thing about this is that Annihilation coincides with Civil War. And so I'm hoping that over the course of this video, it'll help to put Civil War into perspective, because while everything is going on in this story, Captain America and Iron Man are fighting over the Superhuman Registration Act on Earth. And so it really shows how important or how big the Marvel cosmology was, which I imagine is why they decided to publish this when they did. But there are a few key players here in this story. The first is Silver Surfer, although he's going to be background for 90% of this. The second is Super Skrull. The third is Nova. And the fourth is really Drax the Destroyer. He's probably one of the coolest things here. Peter Quill is here, but in terms of Peter Quill going on and forming the Guardians of the Galaxy, as you guys know him, that was Annihilation Conquest is really where that came into play. But Annihilation helped to set the stage for that. But what this does, there was a prologue for this, but the prologue wasn't wildly important. It basically just said, hey guys, here's what's happening. But in Marvel Comics, we have the multiverse, like just all these different universes. There's really an infinite number of them. When they were collapsing during Hickman's run on Avengers and New Avengers, we didn't really see like 99.9% of the universes out there. Hickman was just basically saying, hey, in the background of everything that's going on, these universes are just crashing into each other and just being destroyed. You won't see them, just know that that's happening. But despite all of the multiverse, there's only one negative zone. Now, there's a lot of things about the negative zone that are kind of weird, like reversing polarity, so on and so forth. We don't really need to go into that. But what we do need to touch on is a villain named Annihilus. Now, Annihilus is like the most powerful being in the negative zone, but really it's because of the fact that there are not a whole lot of wildly powerful beings in the negative zone. The negative zone is not like the main Marvel universe, where you have like cosmic entities and you have like Galactus and you have Celestials and Franklin Richards and Molecule Man Orneries. You don't really have that. What you do have is Annihilus in possession of something called the Cosmic Control Rod. And the Cosmic Control Rod is essentially the negative zone equivalent of the power cosmic confined within a device. Now, it's really kind of weird when we talk about this, because back in the day, when Franklin Richards was first introduced, his insane power was attributed to the fact that Reed Richards used the Cosmic Control Rod to help Susan Storm give birth to Franklin. Years later, with Heroes Reborn, Heroes Return, that kind of thing, Marvel basically retconned that to say, hey, Franklin Richards is a mutant and he's just got stupid powers to warp reality. It's just kind of how it is. It was a series of retcons over the course of his publication history, but Annihilus invading the main Marvel universe really came by way of what's called the Crunch. Now, the Crunch is also home to a place called the Kiln, which is like this prison on the edge of the universe. And all that really happens here is the residual energy from the Big Bang, much like an explosion in your hand, basically resonates outward. And so, the energy on the edge of the universe is what the Kiln taps into to power itself and keep people contained. The problem with this is that Annihilus had basically used this fringe border of the universe to invade into the main Marvel universe with the intention of just literally annihilating and destroying everything. One of the first places that he attacked was Xandar, or at least what was left of Xandar. That place had been destroyed multiple times, and it was really just like a series of territories and bubbles just kind of floating out in space. But in the attack on Xandar, it allowed Keith Giffen and Dan Abnett to basically wipe out the entirety of the Nova Corps, save for Richard Rider. And so that's why he's the lone survivor. That's why he's the last member of the Nova Corps, really from Annihilation going forward. And that's one of the reasons why fans loved him so much, because sure, he had a spotty history here and there, and his stories were okay, but what he does here, I mean, like the character as he's depicted, really following the events of Annihilation in his own story and other subsequent stories, fans really latched on to that. They love that version of Richard Rider. But the idea here is that at this point, I mean, you have Peter Quill, you have Richard Rider, you have a handful of people who are literally just staving off where they can. I mean, the Annihilation wave is quite literally just a giant wave of bugs. I mean, that's really all it is. But they're like a plague just sweeping through the universe. And so no one really knows how to deal with this. All they can do is really fight and just stay on the move as often as they can. Now, of course, what we also have here is a situation where Galactus and Silver Surfer have been taken prisoner. Now, the reason why is really just because Thanos helped to make this happen. The reason why Thanos helped to make this happen is because in a lot of ways, he basically just sided with Annihilus out of sheer curiosity. Because remember, Thanos has never really met Annihilus before. He's never really seen him before. And so to have a villain, suddenly show up in the Marvel Universe with this massive army cutting a swath through the Marvel Universe is something that intrigued Thanos, because he just wanted to kind of see where it went from there. So again, it's really a lot of the heroes here just coming together as best they can, holding off against the forces of Annihilus as best they can. But again, Thanos is just kind of like, I want to see where this goes. I want to see how far this stretches on. Now, another part of this is why Annihilation was kind of interesting, is because you had the main Annihilation event, but you also had a lot of side stories as well. Now, we're not going to go into those side stories in this video, but one of the major themes here was Ronan the Accuser and the fact that he was cast out by House Fiero. Now, again, a lot of this really deals with Peter Quill, it deals with Nova talking to one another, really trying to get a grasp of the situation. And something that I hope you notice here is that even with Drax the Destroyer present, they're really just talking about how at this point, they're just kind of trying to take it from one day to the next. At this point, just really trying to live. I mean, that's all they're trying to do here. Now, of course, the capture of Galactus, this is something that was really, really cool. The capture of Galactus was done in a pretty spectacular way, in the sense that we're talking about a being with insane power. We're talking about a being with extreme abilities, but it was really the mind of Thanos that helped to make this happen. And so once he reports back, once he basically tells Annihilation Galactus has fallen, that Galactus has been taken, what Annihilus and his forces do with the help of Thanos is they basically turn Galactus into a weapon. Now, we won't find out exactly what that is. Instead, what initially happens here is we actually have Phyla Vell, who shows up, and she begins talking with Richard Rider, with Peter Quill, with all these different guys, and especially Drax the Destroyer. Now, Phyla Vell is a character that we've never really talked about before, just because of the fact that we've never really had a reason to go in depth into the Marvel mythos, the mythos of his character. But following his death, his wife Elysian, I think it was, used technology on the Saturn Moon Titan to basically create a child for herself for the form of Genus Vell, which eventually was followed up by Phyla Vell. Now, the problem with this was that Marvel was trying to find a way to reconcile the two characters, because at the time, Captain Marvel was not wildly popular. The mantle was not a great big huge deal. Remember, Carol Danvers was still just Miss Marvel back then. And so the idea of having somebody take the place of Captain Marvel at the time was just a reflection of how chaotic and how disorganized a lot of the Marvel cosmology was. But the fact remains here that Phyla Vell was a character that had a very strong relationship with Moondragon. Now, Moondragon was another really cool character too from back in the day. She really actually tied a lot into Drax the Destroyer. What I mean is she's his biological daughter. The way it happened with Drax's character in Marvel Comics is that Arthur Douglas was really just a guy who lived on Earth one day when Thanos decided to attack. Now, I believe this corresponded with Thanos' attempt to pursue the Cosmic Cube. But the idea was that with Arthur Douglas being destroyed and his daughter believed to have been dead, what had happened was that on the moon Titan, the father of Thanos had besieged their god Kronos to basically bring Arthur Douglas back to life, and then task Arthur Douglas with the idea of killing Thanos wherever it is that he gets a chance to do it. And so over the course of his publication history in the early days, Drax the Destroyer was a goof. I mean, he was stupid. Like, literally, he was just a stupid character. He wasn't very intelligent. He was really strong, but he was really more of just like a blunt object as opposed to somebody who was intelligent, calculating, methodical, and extremely capable. The cool thing about his character, though, is that he has the power to sense Thanos' location wherever Thanos happens to be. But really, again, this was all just kind of a reflection of how disheveled and disorganized the Marvel cosmology was back then, because the existence of Drax the Destroyer begged the question, why hasn't he killed Thanos yet if Thanos has just kind of been roaming around out there? Well, it's because nobody ever really took the time to do anything with it. Nobody ever really explored it too much, because again, the Marvel cosmology was never a huge emphasis outside of the Infinity stories by Jim Starlin and a handful of stories about Quasar and Mar-Vell of the Kree. But what we also found out was that the father of Thanos had actually taken the daughter of Arthur Douglas, a girl named Heather, and trained her under his wing. Of course, she learned, or I guess developed telepathy rather, and actually became part of the Infinity Watch alongside Adam Warlock after the Infinity Gauntlet event leading up to the Infinity War storyline. But the fact remains here that Moondragon was in a very, very strong relationship, as close as Marvel got to really bringing it out, a relationship with Phyla-Vell. And what had happened here was that Phyla-Vell and Moondragon were basically paying respects to the family of Phyla, to her brother Genis-Vell, to her father Mar-Vell of the Kree, and then Thanos had really just ambushed her and Moondragon. Now, something to keep in mind here is that Thanos never does anything arbitrarily. While he attacks them, it's really more sending a signal. And the reason why is because Thanos, as smart as he is, plans for every situation, every eventuality, regardless of how minute that eventuality may be. It may be that the chances of a particular, circumstance taking place are 1 in a million, but Thanos will plan for that just in case, so that he always comes out on top. The funny thing about this is that he actually won't come out on top in this story, which is kind of cool. It was a really cool way to kind of shake things up with the cosmology. But again, attacking Moondragon and attacking Phyla-Vell really just kind of sends a message to Drax the Destroyer, because Thanos knows now that Drax will hunt him down regardless of where he is. And that's exactly what happens. In addition to everything that's going on when it comes to this whole annihilation wave going through and attacking everything across the universe, Drax is really just kind of a man on a mission now, where his goal is to kill Thanos. He really has that goal more so than anything else. Now again, with regards to Ronan the Accuser, this coincides with Fiero. There was a reason why I kind of skipped past that, and I'm getting back to it right now. Fiero is one of the ruling houses that exists in the Kree Empire, and what we know is that despite the fact that the Supreme Intelligence was kind of like this spiritual leader of the Kree, in the end, the Kree people would follow whoever it was that seemed to be the most capable of running the Kree Empire. And so what had happened is Ronan the Accuser had basically been challenged by House Fiero, and he had effectively been forced out just by circumstance, in the sense that they had made him look like he was a traitor. And so because of this, he was kind of this outcast, and his mission was to constantly go back and to re-challenge House Fiero and take it back. Now finally, one of the last additions that we get here is Super Skrull. I know I'm throwing a lot at you guys real fast, but again, Annihilation covers a lot in a really short amount of time. Super Skrull was a character that was, well, really in the early days was kind of laughable. He was a Fantastic Four villain for the longest time, but again, this is kind of reinvigorating his character. What happens here is we are essentially met with the arrival of a character by the name of Praxagora. Now, Praxagora is believed to be, and was for a time, one of the henchmen of Annihilus, but she had actually defected, and alongside Super Skrull had held off, or at least tried to hold off, a particular planet. Now, with regards to Super Skrull, he's important in this story, but prior to this, he was just kind of a joke. I mean, he was a nonsensical and a silly character. He was a villain of the Fantastic Four for a while, and if suddenly it came out that Marvel got the rights back to Super Skrull, if it was like 2003, I would have been like, oh yeah, who cares? If it was now, I would be like, oh hell yeah, because Super Skrull is a guy who basically has the powers of the Fantastic Four. Not only that, he can shapeshift like most anybody else, but his ability to control the powers that he has are fine-tuned in the extreme. And so in some ways, he can control his abilities better than like Johnny Storm. Now, of course, Johnny Storm is more fine-tuned now than I would say Super Skrull is, but back during the time when Super Skrull first showed up and over the course of his publication history, he was very adept at using his own abilities. The kicker to all this is that while Praxagora and Super Skrull were trying to save a planet, because of the fact that Praxagora can emit massive amounts of heat and kind of explode like a bomb, Super Skrull had basically used his ability to tap into the powers of Johnny Storm and effectively absorbed the heat that she was putting out and then detonated himself. And so because of that, he was presumed to have been dead, but what she says is he died like a hero. Now again, where he had historically been a villain, this was Keith Giffen, this was Dan Abnett coming back and saying, no, he's basically going to be a good guy now. Like, he died as a hero and he's going to be a strong character. Now, another individual here is a guy by the name of Ravenous, and Ravenous was kind of a weird situation. He was kind of like the field commander of Annihilus's forces, and he was really a guy that Ronan the Accuser had a beef with really more than anybody else. He would basically herald the coming of the Annihilation wave and wipe out anybody who basically could pose a challenge to destroy the Annihilation wave, or anybody who could really put a dent in it. So he was kind of like the field scout. But the fact remains here, with Thanos and Annihilus basically taking Galactus and Silver Surfer and using them as weapons, initially we didn't know exactly how it was that they had planned to do this. But what happens is Annihilus really asked the question. He says, what does it mean that we now have Galactus as a weapon? How does that function? And what Thanos does is he sits down and says, well, the way it was previously believed is that we as sentient beings would look down and we would see Galactus, and we would see Galactus as a biological being. Now, what Thanos also says is this is not the case. Now, we as comic book readers had known this for some time, and in fact, during the trial of Reed Richards, Marvel established that the appearance of Galactus is relatively
repulsive to whoever sees him. And so if Galactus were to invade the Skrull homeworld and destroy it, like he did in Secret Invasion, the Skrulls would see Galactus as a giant Skrull with the purple helmet and all that kind of stuff. When humans see him, they see him as human. When Kree see him, they see him as Kree, so on and so forth. He's really just an energy construct that inhabits a physical body. And that's what Thanos says. Thanos says when Galactus goes and consumes a planet, he's basically just replenishing his life energy. But as we see him, it's just a vessel containing all these energies. And so what we can basically do is we can essentially kind of like hack into Galactus, so to speak, and we can just keep his body perpetually absorbing energy. But when that happens, we'll just channel that energy back for us to use so that we could discharge it out and destroy planets or destroy any kind of invading force or something like that. And so Galactus will always starve and his body will always feed. His body will never be satisfactory. So it'll be like a battery that's constantly charging with us constantly putting that energy out. So again, it's really just kind of a way to weaponize Galactus. But the fact remains here that, again, because of the fact that Peter Quill, because Richard Rider, because this united defense front that they have is really kind of trying to impose guerrilla warfare tactics, because of the fact that the Annihilation wave is going through and just conquering planet after planet, they're constantly on the run. And it comes to a point whereby the planet that they're on is successfully invaded by the Annihilation wave and everybody really begins to flee. Everybody really begins to take off. Now, of course, because of this massive amount of energy that's discharged, it actually jumps Super Skrull out of his presumed death and back to the realm of the living. Now, we don't really find out why that happened. It was really just this discharge of energy that brought him back. But the fact remains here that with Super Skrull effectively resurrected, with Ronan the Accuser, with Firelord, these different heralds of Galactus, with all them being here, the idea is to basically get out as fast as they can. And the reason why this is done is because Annihilus and Thanos had literally just tested Galactus as a weapon and fired this massive amount of energy at the planet that Peter Quill and all these people were on. And so while they're panicking, while they're trying to get out, while they're trying to run, we basically have Drax the Destroyer stay behind and face off against all these forces of Annihilus. Now, this is where Drax the Destroyer went from being like this goofball, silly character to being this ridiculously powerful character. Because remember, the planet wasn't destroyed simply because of the fact that the Heralds of Galactus, Stardust, Red Sun, I think it is, they had basically held off some of Galactus's power because it wasn't like the full extent of his abilities cut loose. We'll actually see that later on. But with this energy basically being held off, with this energy being pushed back, it spares the planet and it allows Drax the Destroyer to start cutting through and attacking all of these members of the Annihilation wave. And that's exactly what he does. He literally just starts ripping through every last one of them. And it's cool to see because fans were able to sit down and look at this and say, man, dude, Drax the Destroyer is a badass. He's literally just rampaging and tearing through all these hundreds of thousands of members of the Annihilation wave without any real effort. Now, this is, of course, because of the fact that Drax the Destroyer has almost unlimited stamina. It's because of the fact that Drax the Destroyer is wildly strong, and because of the fact that he's a man on a mission right now to kill Thanos. That's all he wants to do. And so all these people that he kills, all these enemies that he destroys are just along his way. Now, something else to point out here is that because this takes place during the events of Civil War with the superhuman community fighting on Earth, there is a tie-in where Nova actually goes to Earth. We won't get into that. We actually covered that during my video series on Civil War. But one of the first things he does is he basically sends out a warning to Earth saying, hey guys, this Annihilation wave is spreading across the universe. You guys need to do something because the most prominent heroes who exist right now in the universe are either dead or dying or they're fighting. Like there's almost no way to hold this Annihilation wave back. And that's what makes this story so unique, is because while we have heroes like Drax the Destroyer fighting the Annihilation wave, while we have Nova and we have Peter Quill and we have Gamora, and we have a lot of these heroes who are fighting against the Annihilation wave, they're fighting a losing battle, guys. I mean, they're not winning. It's not like they're coming out on top. They're losing in almost every single turn. It's one step forward and they get pushed 2 steps back. And so it's a really kind of a cool situation here because we're used to seeing heroes engaging in a battle and then just, incrementing forward. It's a war of inches. They take an inch forward, an inch forward, an inch forward, and then eventually they win. Annihilation's not like that. Now, again, because of the fact that Thanos is allied with Annihilus, the motivations of Annihilus are still pretty mysterious to him. But having taken Moondragon prisoner as one of the most powerful telepaths in the Marvel Universe, he really sits down with her. The two of them, of course, start having a conversation and so on. And she's like, there's things you need to know about what it is that Annihilus is doing. And she basically says, you underestimate what it is that Annihilus intends. And then Thanos says, then fine, then show me what it is that he wants to do. Let me see his mind. And when Moondragon basically creates a link between the mind of Annihilus and the mind of Thanos without Annihilus realizing what's going on, Thanos comes to the realization that Annihilus isn't simply just wanting to take over the universe. Annihilus wants to annihilate all life in the Marvel Universe, the main Marvel Universe, and the negative zone. Now, presumably, we would expect that because there's only one negative zone and any universe can access it, Annihilus would basically move on to all the other universes and wipe out all life across the multiverse in its entirety. Keith Giffen and Dan Abnett don't go as far as to say that. We're just kind of left to our own own speculation here. At least we're kind of left to believe that. But in response, Thanos is like, he's a madman. Like, we cannot allow him to do that. And so what Thanos basically did is he sat down and he says, I programmed a trap, or a back door, so to speak, to essentially free Galactus. But it comes with a caveat. Only a person of sufficient power would be able to free Galactus. If a person that does not have enough power tries to do it, it would probably trigger an explosion that would basically unleash all of Galactus's powers and wipe out everything across the cosmos. And so what Thanos says is, Moondragon, come with me. We're gonna try to free Galactus here. But in the midst of all this, remember, Drax is hunting him down, and Drax finally finds him. Now, of course, the funny thing about this is Moondragon, as the daughter of Drax, says, hey, look, you can't do this. You have to stop. Thanos is going to free Galactus. Galactus is the only one with enough power to stop this annihilation wave. Now, in truth, the cosmic entities could step in anytime they wanted to, but with Annihilus, it's a physical force tearing through the universe. And so for the cosmic entities, for the Celestials, these beings that are wildly powerful, it doesn't matter to them, because if all life is wiped out, at some point along the line, life would begin anew. Life would start all over again. Either that or the universe would just be occupied by a new force. It's not like a being is trying to wipe out the universe in its entirety, like physically destroy the universe, because then it would result in the destruction of eternity and infinity. It would result in the cosmic entities not having a place to reside, so then they would step in. But for right now, what Annihilus is doing is no different than wiping out all life on a planet. He's just doing it on a cosmic scale. So again, that's why we don't really see the cosmic entities getting involved here. But the fact remains, with Moondragon trying to appease to her father, hey, look, you can't do this. He says, look, I've been created for one purpose. And in the end, what he does is he actually just kind of punches a hole through Thanos, kills him, and rips his heart out. And so this was huge when this happened. When this first dropped in Annihilation, it was mind-blowing, because it was like, well, I guess Thanos is dead now. We had never really seen anything like this before. With the character of Thanos, there's been times where he kind of died, where he was like, well, he's dead, but not really. There were times like when he first showed up and he fought Iron Man, where it turned out he was just a robot, but we had never really seen an instance where he was effectively in the realm of the afterlife, dead and gone forever, or at least it seemed that way. And so in response to this, Moondragon is basically like, you've doomed us. You've totally screwed us. Thanos was going to be the one to free Galactus. Galactus is going to be the one to save us. There's this modified power cell, but no one here has enough power to do that. The only person that has a power to free Galactus now is Silver Surfer, and he's currently being held captive. Well, then Drax the Destroyer takes the next logical step and says, fine, then we'll free the Silver Surfer, because there's no trap built around him. And so because of that, Silver Surfer is effectively freed from his captivity. He's grabbed by Drax and he's told, look, channel whatever energy you have left, whatever power you have left that hasn't been taken from you and weaponized, channel that energy, and you have to free Galactus, because if you don't, it's going to lead to the destruction of all things in existence in this universe. This is literally a last-ditch effort. I mean, this is the point where there's no one left to fight. I mean, all the people that can fight are trying to muster up as best they can on the fringes of space. You have Peter Quill, you have Nova, you have Phyla-Vell, you have a handful of people that are mustering this little pittance of a force, but in terms of anybody who can really hold back the Annihilation wave, they're not there anymore. So what happens is Silver Surfer is successfully able to free Galactus, but what happens next is mind-blowing. And the reason why I say that is because over the course of Marvel's publication history, we've seen Galactus where he's miffed. We've seen Galactus where he's a little irritated. We've seen Galactus where he's a little curious. We've never seen Galactus where he's pissed. Like, we've never seen mad, angry, pissed off Galactus. And one of the greatest quotes in the history of Marvel Comics is when Galactus is freed and he says, "Know me, Annihilus. Know me and no fear." And I was like, how badass is that? I actually tweeted that on Twitter. I thought it was pretty amazing. But what he does is he sends the Silver Surfer out. He says, "Surfer, go forward and tell anybody that doesn't want to die to get out of here." Now, this coincides with Drax the Destroyer grabbing whatever forces he has left at his disposal, traveling back to the planet Hala, to Kree-Lar, and basically wiping out House Fiero. What we also find out is that because of the fact that House Fiero was trying to cement itself as the absolute authority on the planet Hala, and because of the fact that the Supreme Intelligence was still a religious and spiritual leader, they had actually lobotomized the Supreme Intelligence, and so they kind of gave it a half-life. And so what Ron the Accuser is forced to do is basically destroy the Supreme Intelligence. So again, something that I hope you're noticing here is that Keith Giffen and Dan Abnett in a lot of ways are just taking an axe to some of the most notable aspects of Marvel cosmology and really just rebuilding it all. I mean, just kind of restructuring and reforming the entire Marvel cosmology all over again, which is why Annihilation is so important, because this is like the stepping stone. This is the foundation for everything that comes after in the Marvel cosmology. The Thanos limited series, Annihilation Conquest, the Thanos Imperative, all that kind of good stuff. This was all built on what it was that was done in Annihilation. And so finally, with Silver Surfer being told to go out and tell everybody that Galactus is effectively going to eliminate the Annihilation wave, that's exactly what he does. I mean, this is the full unbridled power of Galactus. this. Like, it's not some grandiose, super, spectacle of him talking and chanting, and doing all kinds of nonsense. Instead, he just lets off a massive energy burst, and it destroys a huge portion of the Annihilation wave to the point that it's basically crippled. The forces of Annihilus have effectively been obliterated almost in their entirety. So that was it. The whole thing comes crashing down because Galactus just disperses all this energy. Now, the reason why people also loved Nova so much, why they loved Richard Rider so much, is because of the last tail bit of the story when he goes against Annihilus. Remember, Annihilus has the quantum bands, which previously belonged to Quasar, and these are bands that allow its wielder to tap into cosmic energies. And so it's really Annihilus fighting off against Nova with more power than Nova really has to hold off on his own. But the cool thing about this is again, Keith Giffen, this is Dan Abnett saying, hey, there's a new order, there's a new structure, there's a new hierarchy in terms of how things function. And because of the fact that the quantum bands basically, adhere themselves to a particular user until a better user is summoned later on, Phi-Level steps forward and the bands leave Annihilus and they attach themselves to Phi-Level. Now, if you want to know more about the quantum bands, I actually have a video on Quasar Explained that you're welcome to check out that'll give you the information on how those quantum bands work, why they were created, and so on. But without these bands, the power of Annihilus is nowhere near what it was supposed to be, because remember, all the power of the Nova Corps now resides within Richard Rider himself. And so instead of the power of Nova being split among 100 people, now it's all confined into one. And so because of this, his powers are far beyond what Annihilus has at the current point in time. And this is proven when he basically says, this is for Nova Corps, reaches down the throat of Annihilus and pulls his heart out. And so this was so cool because it was awesome to see Richard Rider finally get his due. It was awesome to see Richard Rider, basically save the Marvel Universe in his own way. Of course, Galactus was really the one that set it all up, but at the end of the day, it also allowed Richard Rider to, to get his revenge for the Nova Corps. But the fact remains here that, following the defeat of Annihilus, again, this story wasn't too long, it wasn't too drawn out, but following the defeat of Annihilus, it was really, armistice in a lot of different ways. It was people signing treaties, it was people going back to their regular lives, people trying to pick up the pieces, societies trying to rebuild. It was really cool because it was Keith Giffen and Dan Abnett saying, this is how things are right now. The Kree Empire does not have the Supreme Intelligence anymore. Now it's just Ronan the Accuser running the Kree Empire. This is one of the reasons why in Inhumans Volume 3, Ronan the Accuser is the one running the Kree Empire instead of the Supreme Intelligence. When the Inhumans come along and we see Black Bolt of the Inhumans challenging Ronan for control of the Kree Empire. That's why we have like War of Kings, which is Vulcan versus Black Bolt. But again, it created a really, really cool landscape because from that point going forward, or at least from this point going forward, everything starts to change. We get this really cool snowball effect and we get all kinds of great expansions that would most likely or not have been done had Annihilation not been written. But with that being said, guys, if you're new here to Comics Explained, you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you leave a like, make sure you leave a comment, and be sure to hit the subscribe button to become part of the Rob Corps. And yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.